The darkness of the North Sea on the night of September 30, 1942, was not merely an absence of light, it was a tactical shroud, a blanket of invisibility that the Royal Navy had learned to wear like a second skin. North of Ameland, one of the desolate, windswept Frisian islands guarding the Dutch coast, the water lay unusually flat, an oily black expanse merging seamlessly with a moonless sky. In this void, 9 shadows moved with predatory grace. They were the boats of the 21st Motor Torpedo Boat Flotilla, a collection of mahogany and spruce hulls packed with high-octane fuel and high explosives, gliding forward on their auxiliary engines. To the casual observer, they might have seemed insignificant against the vastness of the ocean, fragile constructs of wood and glue, venturing into a war dominated by steel dreadnoughts. But to Lieutenant Peter Dickens, the 32-year-old officer commanding from the bridge of the lead boat, this calm dark night offered the perfect canvas for a masterpiece of violence. The silence was absolute, save for the muffled burble of the underwater exhausts and the slap of water against the chines, a deceptive tranquility that masked the lethal potential of the force moving toward the enemy. They were hunting, and their quarry was already moving through the trap, blissfully unaware that the hunters had become the hunted. German Convoy 348 had departed Cuxhaven earlier that morning, a procession of 8 merchant vessels sitting low in the water, their bellies heavy with Swedish iron or destined for Rotterdam. This was not a commercial venture, it was a transfusion of vital blood into the arteries of the German war machine. By late 1942, the Third Reich was insatiable. Every tank rolling toward Stalingrad, every artillery shell fired in North Africa, and every steel girder reinforcing the Atlantic Wall began as raw or without the millions of tons shipped annually from Scandinavia through these coastal waters. The German industrial complex would starve, and the Wehrmacht's wheels would grind to a halt. Protecting this lifeline was a priority of the highest order for the Kriegsmarine, which is why 5 heavily armed patrol boats, known as Vorposten Boot, formed a protective ring around the merchants. These escorts were formidable adversaries, often converted trawlers or whalers that retained their seaworthiness, while being upgunned with 88mm cannons and a forest of anti-aircraft weaponry. The German commanders aboard these ships felt a degree of security born of geography and doctrine. They were sailing in their own coastal waters, under the umbrella of shore-based artillery and Luftwaffe air cover. Their guns were trained seaward, toward the open North Sea and the direction of Great Britain, from where they assumed any surface threat would materialize. They scanned the skies for bombers, believing the air to be the primary danger. In their rigid adherence to expectation, they had left their backs exposed, never imagining that the British would dare to navigate the shallow, treacherous shoal waters between the Convoy and the Dutch coast. Lieutenant Peter Dickens was counting on exactly that arrogance. Operating from HMS Beehive at Felixstowe, Dickens had cultivated a reputation as a commander who blended aggression with a meticulous, almost scientific approach to coastal warfare. He understood that in a straight fight between his fragile wooden boats and the heavily armored German escorts, the British would lose. The Vorpostenboot could absorb punishment that would disintegrate an MTB. Their 88mm shells could reduce a gunboat to splinters with a single hit. Victory, therefore, required asymmetry. It required rewriting the rules of engagement to favor speed, surprise, and the terrifying uncertainty of night combat. The flotilla he led was a composite force, a tactical ecosystem designed to overwhelm the enemy's senses. It consisted of motor gunboats, MTBs, armed with rapid-fire 20mm Oerlikon cannons and twin Vickers machine guns, and motor torpedo boats, MTBs, carrying the knockout punch in the form of 18-inch torpedoes. The doctrine was brutal but effective. The MGBs would close to point-blank range and unleash a torrent of automatic fire to suppress the enemy gunners, blinding them with tracer fire and chaos. Under this cover, the MTBs would slip through the defensive screen, deliver their torpedoes to the merchant ships, and vanish. It was a dance of death that required nerves of steel and perfect coordination. As the flotilla crept closer to the interception point, the tension aboard the small boats was palpable. Men stood at their action stations, wrapped in heavy duffel coats against the biting North Sea chill, their eyes adjusting to the profound darkness. The smell of the boats was distinctive, a mixture of salt spray, DAMP, wood, and the pervasive, sweet stench of high-octane petrol. Below decks, the mechanics monitored the massive Packard engines, beasts capable of unleashing thousands of horsepower at a moment's notice, waiting for the telegraph to ring for full speed. The intelligence report received at Felixstowe had been precise. Convoy 348 would transit north of Ameland near midnight. Dickens checked his watch. The timing was aligning perfectly. He had made the critical tactical decision to approach from the landward starboard side, placing his boats between the German convoy and the Dutch coast. It was a risky maneuver, bringing them dangerously close to the sandbanks and shoals that guarded the islands. But the payoff was total surprise. The German lookouts would be staring into the empty blackness of the north, while the attack would come from the south, silhouetted against nothing but the dark landmass. The waiting ended at 23:50 hours, not with a visual sighting, but with a sound. The deep, rhythmic thrumming of heavy diesel engines drifted across the water, a mechanical heartbeat announcing the presence of thousands of tons of shipping. Then came the drone of aircraft engines high above. This was the final element of Dickens's plan, coordination with the Royal Air Force. On cue, the sky suddenly tore open. Parachute flares dropped by the bombers ignited overhead, burning with a blinding white magnesium brilliance. The artificial sun hung in the sky, casting stark, shifting shadows across the seascape. For the British crews, the scene was theatrical in its clarity. There, illuminated in stark relief, was Convoy 348. The 8 merchant ships were arranged in 2 columns, plodding along with a deceptive sluggishness, while the 5 escorts prowled the perimeter. For perhaps 40 seconds, the Germans were frozen in the spotlight, exposed and vulnerable. Panic rippled through the German formation. Recognizing they were lit up, the escorts fired their own flares, desperately trying to illuminate the attackers they knew must be lurking in the dark. But looking into the darkness from a pool of light is difficult, and Dickens's boats remained invisible shadows rushing in from the unexpected quarter. Attack! The order was given, and the silence of the approach was shattered by the roar of engines. Throttles were pushed to the stops, and the bows of the British boats lifted as they surged onto the plain, accelerating to 40 knots. The sea, previously calm, was now churned into white foam by the screws of 9 vessels charging into battle. They opened fire at 1,500 yards. The MTBs initiated the violence, their Oerlikon cannons spitting lines of green and red traces that arched across the water. The sound was deafening, a staccato hammering that vibrated through the wooden decks and into the bones of the crew. The 20mm explosive shells hammered the superstructures of the German escorts, shattering glass, splintering wood, and cutting down the exposed gun crews scrambling to man their weapons. The German response was immediate, but chaotic. The heavy boom of the 88mm guns joined the cacophony, sending geysers of water skyward as shells landed among the charging boats. However, the German gunners were fighting a nightmare scenario. Their heavy weapons were designed to track aircraft or slow-moving surface ships, not small, agile targets weaving at 40 knots through the darkness. The British boats were erratic, difficult to track, and closing at a speed that defied the traverse mechanisms of the older German guns. Leading the charge was MGB 18, commanded by Lieutenant Smith, with a recklessness that bordered on suicidal bravery. Smith drove his boat directly at the nearest Vorpus, designated VP 1313. He intended to draw its fire, to become the focus of the enemy's rage, so that the torpedo boats could slip past. His gunners raked the German ship from stem to stern. The Oerlikon shells walked up the deck of the trawler, silencing one defensive position after another. On the bridge of MGB 18, the air was thick with cordite smoke and the scream of ricochet. They were trading punches with a heavyweight, relying on speed and the ferocity of their initial assault to keep the German heads down. Amidst this storm of metal, the motor torpedo boats executed their part of the doctrine. MTB 234, engines screaming, bypassed the duel between the gunboats and the escorts. She sliced through the water, closing the distance to the merchant column with terrifying speed. At 800 yards, the range was point-blank for a torpedo engagement. The commander lined up his sights on the silhouette of a large freighter and gave the order to fire. With a sharp hiss of compressed air, 2 18-inch torpedoes leaped from their tubes and splashed into the North Sea. Their internal engines ignited, and they streaked away, leaving bubbly wakes that phosphoresced in the disturbed water. The crew of MTB 234 counted the seconds, the agonizing interval between launch and impact, where time seems to stretch and distort. The target was the Thule, a Swedish registered freighter of substantial size, burdened with over 25,000 tons of iron ore. She was sitting duck, heavy and slow. 20 seconds after launch, the first torpedo struck her amidships. The detonation was cataclysmic. The warhead, packed with high explosives, punched through the steel hull and unleashed its energy into the ship's vitals. The shockwave broke the Thule's back. Under the immense weight of her cargo, the ship had no reserve buoyancy, no chance to fight the damage. She folded like a hinge, her bow and stern rising hideously into the air as the center was dragged down by the flooded hold. It took less than 90 seconds for the massive massive vessel to vanish entirely. The violence of the sinking was absolute. Of her crew of 11, 10 were dragged down into the freezing vortex. Only one man managed to cling to a piece of wreckage, screaming into the night, until he was fished out hours later. The reports later mentioned 2 women had been aboard. They were never seen again. While the Thule died her violent death, the battle raged on across the convoy. Another torpedo found its mark, slamming into Vorpesten Boot 2003. This vessel, formerly the Belgian patrol ship Ludsboot 7, was performing escort duties when the torpedo caught her in the engine room. The explosion was even more devastating on the smaller hull than it had been on the freighter. The blast tore the bottom out of the ship, instantly killing the engineering crew and snapping the keel. She rolled onto her beam ends, capsizing in moments before sliding beneath the surface. It was a massacre. Of the 42 men aboard, 21 were killed instantly or drowned in the wreckage. They vanished into the cold dark of the Wadden Sea, joining the thousands of sailors who have no grave but the sea. The British were tearing the convoy apart, dismantling the defensive screen and sinking the cargo with a ruthlessness that stunned the German defenders. However, the Germans were not passive victims. They were veteran sailors fighting for their lives, and despite the surprise, they fought back with desperate courage. Aboard Vorpesten Boot 1313, the ship engaging Lieutenant Smith's MGB-18, the scene was one of carnage. Matron Bernard Terzinski manned the forward 88mm gun. It was his first combat voyage, and the reality of war was crashing down around him in a literal sense. The gun position was open, devoid of an armored turret, leaving the crew exposed to the sweeping fire of the British Orlikons. Around him, his comrades were falling, cut down by the relentless stream of 20mm shells. Terzinski later recounted the terror of that night, admitting that he didn't know if it was bravery or fear that kept him moving. A British shell struck him in the shoulder, the impact spinning him around and dropping him to the blood-slicked deck. Pain seared through him, and he was convinced he was dying. But the instinct to survive, the training ingrained through endless drills, took over. With one arm useless and bleeding profusely, he struggled back to his feet. He grabbed an 88mm shell, shoved it into the breech of the cannon, and screamed at his gun captain to load. Terzinski sighted the gun on the muzzle flashes of the British boat tormenting them. He fired. The 88mm shell, weighing nearly 20 pounds, crossed the short distance in a fraction of a second. It struck MGB-18 squarely in the bow. The effect on the wooden boat was devastating. The explosion blew away nearly 10 feet of the forward structure, turning the sleek hull into a shattered wreck. Fuel tanks ruptured, and fire, the greatest fear of the coastal forces crews, erupted instantly. The flames roared upward, fed by the high-octane petrol, illuminating the boat as a beacon in the night. Lieutenant Smith fought to control his dying vessel, but she was rapidly taking on water, and the fire was spreading uncontrollably. The hunter had been mortally wounded. Realizing the boat was lost, Smith gave the order to abandon ship. The crew, disciplined even in disaster, went over the side into the hostile sea. The water temperature was 14 degrees Celsius, cold enough to kill through hypothermia in half an hour. This moment, the sinking of MGB-18, could have been the turning point where a tactical victory morphed into a tragedy for the British. But Peter Dickens was watching. Seeing the flames consume one of his boats, he did not hesitate. In a display of cold nerve and loyalty that defined the ethos of the coastal forces, Dickens brought his own boat alongside the burning wreck. The German guns were still firing, shells splashing around them, tracers zipping overhead. To stop a boat in the middle of a firefight was madness. It made them a stationary target for every German gunner looking for revenge. Yet, Dickens held position. His crew leaned over the gunwales, hauling the oil-soaked, freezing survivors of MGB-18 from the water. They worked with frantic speed, grabbing arms, uniforms, anything to pull their shipmates to safety. Miraculously, they got them all. Every single man from Lieutenant Smith's crew was rescued. Not one was left to drown or be captured. Smith, the last to leave, ensured his boat was scuttled to prevent the Germans from salvaging sensitive equipment, and MGB-18 sank beneath the waves, the only British vessel lost that night. With his ammunition expended, his torpedoes fired, and a full load of survivors crowding the decks, Dickens ordered the withdrawal. The flotilla turned for home, engines roaring as they sped away from the burning remnants of the convoy. They left behind a scene of devastation, burning oil slicks, debris fields, and the desperate cries of German sailors in the water. The return journey to Felixstowe was a 6-hour endurance test of cold and exhaustion, but the adrenaline of the victory kept them warm. They had accomplished the impossible. 9 small boats had taken on a heavily defended convoy, and won. The Germans, in their official communiques 2 days later, tried to spin the disaster. They claimed 5 of British attackers had been sunk and 2 others heavily damaged. They hailed Bernard Terzinski as a hero, broadcasting his name on the radio to boost morale, but it was a hollow boast. The reality was that the Royal Navy had lost 1 boat, scuttled by her own hand, and suffered 0 fatalities. In exchange, they had sunk 2 enemy ships, killed 31 German sailors, and sent thousands of tons of irreplaceable iron ore to the bottom of the sea. The strategic ramifications of the engagement at Ameland echoed far beyond the immediate tactical loss. The battle proved that the safe coastal routes were no longer secure. The illusion of German control over the Wadden Sea had been shattered. Throughout 1943 and 1944, this scenario would play out dozens of times. British coastal forces, emboldened by successes like Ameland, turned the narrow seas into a graveyard for German shipping. They forced the enemy to commit more and more resources to defense, more flagships, more escorts, more air cover resources that were desperately needed on the Eastern Front or in the Atlantic. By August 1944, the pressure was so intense that German shipping ceased moving by daylight entirely. The RAF had made the day suicidal, and the MTBs owned the night. Bernard Terzinski survived the war, carrying a British bullet in his shoulder. As a permanent reminder of the night the sea erupted in fire, he lived to tell his story to researchers, stripping away the propaganda to reveal the sheer terror of facing the British mosquitoes. He spoke of the confusion, the overwhelming firepower of the gunboats, and the shock of seeing ships disappear in seconds. His account provided the human context to the cold statistics of the war log. It highlighted the disconnect between the rigid German doctrine, which relied on orders and structure, and the flexible, initiative-driven warfare practiced by the Royal Navy. The German helmsman of VP 1313, Baumgart, had saved his ship by turning the wheel without orders to dodge a torpedo, only to be reprimanded later for acting without permission. That incident encapsulated the failure of the German naval system. In the coastal war, a system that punished initiative was destined to lose against the system that thrived on it. Lieutenant Peter Dickens ended the war highly decorated, his name synonymous with the aggressive spirit of the coastal forces. In his memoirs, he reflected on the Ameland action, not just as a victory, but as a validation of the men he led. They were civilians in uniform, yachtsmen, bankers, mechanics who manned the wooden boats and faced down the steel monsters of the Kriegsmarine. They fought with a unique blend of professionalism and piracy, utilizing the cover of darkness to strike at the heart of the enemy's supply lines. The engagement on September 30, 1942, remains a textbook example of asymmetric warfare. It demonstrated that with the right tactics, superior intelligence, and unwavering courage, a smaller force could inflict catastrophic damage on a larger one. The iron ore that went down with the Thule never became tanks to fight at Kursk or Normandy. The crew of VP 2003 never fired their guns again. The British Motor Torpedo Boats had proven that the night belonged to them, and in the cold, dark waters north of Ameland, they had written a chapter of naval history that would be studied for generations. It was a victory of wood over steel, of initiative over doctrine, and of the indomitable spirit of the men who went to sea in the little ships.